The Pride Month conversation series over here at LGBTQ Victory Institute. We are delighted to be bringing you this series that's focused on moments and leaders in LGBTQ history that continue to inspire us. And today's topic is a truly exciting one. Today we'll be talking about foundational gay rights activist Frank Kameny, who starting in the 50s and into the 60s and beyond, was using some of the first pro-LGBTQ legal arguments, organized some of the first gay rights marches, and so much more. And here to talk about Kameny and that amazing legacy is Dr. Eric Cervini. Eric is an historian, and he is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Deviant War, The Homosexual of the United States, The Homosexual versus the United States of America, which you can order now. And without further ado, here's Eric.
Hello, hello.
Hi, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, I'm so excited to talk about this topic, and especially with you, because this book is truly it's a big work. You don't see you don't see books this thick this often that are biographies of gay rights activists. So
it is thick, but the paperback actually came out today, and they managed to shrink the thickness of the pages, so it's like half as thick. So and a big part of it is endnotes, so not to scare anyone away.
Well, the notes just point to just how thorough the research and the digging through the archives and all of the reading that you did was. I mean, there are some very interesting charts in the book. But yeah, I think we should start sort of chronologically here and learn a little bit about Frank. Can you tell us about his early life? Where did he grow up? How did he grow up? And how did he find himself interested in astronomy?
Sure, yeah. You kind of started exactly where I would begin, which is, first and foremost, he was an astronomer. He was obsessed from a very early age with the stars and studying the physics behind them. Ended up getting his PhD in astronomy at Harvard, and very quickly, that was in 1956. And so a lot of people know the next year, that was the launch of Sputnik in the beginnings of the space race between us and the Soviet Union. And so you couldn't have picked a better time to have been an astrophysicist in America, and let alone a Harvard-educated one. And so he pretty soon started working for the federal government, for the Defense Department, working on some missile systems. And almost immediately after he got hired, the government found out he was gay. And so he became one of the victims of what we now call the Lavender Scare, which was a systematic persecution and removal of federal employees throughout the 50s and 60s. So a lot of people have heard of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. At an even higher rate, homosexuals, as they were called, or sexual deviants, were also victims of that same spirit of paranoia. So Frank was one of the early victims, and what stands him apart and what made him deserve a book was he was the first to fight back. So he took his dismissal. He sued the Defense Department. He was the first to take his case, or any case, against the federal government, claiming the civil rights of homosexuals were being infringed, to the Supreme Court. And when that failed, he started what was essentially Washington's first gay lobbying organization, called the Mattachine Society, and first to picket outside of the White House for gay rights, first to testify in Congress on behalf of gay rights. So just an incredible number of firsts. And this was all in the generation before Stonewall. And so telling his story alongside what else was happening in the 60s with the Black freedom movement, with women's liberation, with the path to trans liberation, was something I was really interested in doing, especially as a white cis gay man myself.
One of the phrases that comes up a lot in the book is "gay is good," which I think it might be an abbreviation for a more articulate argument there. But what's the significance of that, and what did that mean to Kameny?
Well, this was, like I said, the 1960s. And so the idea that, first of all, that gays were a minority group to begin with was almost unheard of. That was a very new concept, really beginning the decade prior in the 50s, at least in the US. And Frank Kameny, looked around him and saw, Washington, D.C. had more than a dozen gay bars in the 50s and 60s. And he saw this underground gay culture that was very secretive. But he also saw, people who were engaging in homosexual activity. That didn't just mean that you were like any other straight person who engaged in this behavior. He said, well, this is actually part of a persecuted group. We're part of a community. And he recognized that actually, if we're going to convince not just the rest of the country and the courts and politicians that the LGBTQ plus community, which that acronym wasn't in use at the time, that existed and that we actually had rights that needed to be protected. First, we had to convince ourselves that it wasn't a bad thing to be sexually deviant, as they called it, or to be gay. So he looked to the Black Freedom Movement. In the early 1960s, you have, of course, Birmingham, and even before that, the student sit-ins in North Carolina. And he sees this reclaiming of morality that Black activists were utilizing and saying, actually, we're the ones who are being deprived of our rights, and the immoral ones are these white Southern segregationists. And so he said, what if I did something similar and said, actually, being gay, I'm not the immoral one. Actually, being gay is a good thing. And the immoral ones, this is before homophobia even existed as a word, the real immoral actors here are the federal government and people who now we would deem homophobic. And so it was this really, really innovative legal argument. He first made this claim in legal argumentation in his lawsuit in 1961. And then eventually, after hearing Stokely Carmichael and others within the Black Power movement saying Black is beautiful, he said, we need that exact same thing applied to our movement, and essentially Xeroxed it, adapted it, and turned it into gay is good. Just as it is today, Washington was really dominated by the federal workforce, people who worked for the federal government or in private companies that served the federal government. So that meant not only were you subject to the laws and the regulations of the federal government, but also you likely had to have a security clearance for many of the things that were going on at the height of the Cold War. And so if you were gay or queer, as we would now call it, then you had to conceal that at all costs, because if you were found to be engaging in homosexual activity by the Vice Squad, for example, there would be literally police officers whose sole jobs were to hunt down homosexuals, get them arrested, and then expose them to the federal government, to their family, to the news media, which would often publicize these arrests. You had to go to extreme measures to make sure that you weren't discovered to be a sexual deviant. And so what happened to Frank Kameny is when he was caught, right, the federal government, the Defense Department learned from the FBI, even though he was arrested in a public restroom in San Francisco, that arrest information made its way to the FBI, which then informed his employer when he was going through his background check. And so that's usually how it happened. It was the FBI was that kind of central clearinghouse for this mode of persecution. And, it was that forcing out of the closet, as we would now call it, and his two worlds that he had to keep separate. Suddenly they collided, and he was forced to kind of grapple with his sexual identity being now public. And so what he had to do was convince other people within the gay underground that, hey, not only are we a community, not only is being gay good, but we need you to come out onto the streets and protest on behalf of other queers. And that was just unheard of at the time, because there were literally, you can look at the FBI file, there were photographs taken of people who were marching in front of the White House in 1965 and beyond. And so it was just a very scary proposition, because if you were even alleged to be a sexual deviant, then you could lose your job. So it was a very, very difficult struggle. And it wasn't really until Stonewall and this new generation of activists who flooded into what we then called the homophile movement, from the anti-war movement, from women's liberation, who said, we don't really give a flying F, about whether or not the federal government knows we're queer, because we're liberated and we need to fight to tear down the entire system. And so Frank was trying to enable that and setting some of the groundwork before that big influx of a new generation that ultimately replaced and overshadowed him.
I think looking back today, it's kind of weird. It's kind of strange, this obsession that the government had, and it wasn't just the military. It was kind of all of the government. It was obsessed in a way that it feels like didn't even match society at the time. Almost,
Mm-hmm.
it was a true obsession. What was so remarkable about Frank and how he was able to sort of navigate that in such a different way that had never been done before? And what was usually the result of these sorts of proceedings? Like, how did people normally go?
Well, usually if the government found out that you were gay, then your boss would pull you into their office and say, we have this information, we found your arrest record, you have two choices. Either you can stay and we can officially dismiss you because of immoral conduct, rather, or you can quietly resign and we'll pretend like this never happened. And so, of course, the vast majority of people chose that latter route of just resigning, moving into a different field, going into private industry or academia. And that was certainly an option for Frank. He could have gone to teach astrophysics, or he could have found a non-security clearance requiring job, but he chose to fight. And in fact, he really didn't have a job, despite a Harvard PhD in astrophysics, didn't have a long-term job for the rest of his life. He died in 2011. And, I think it was a very conscious decision on his part that, if he went to go teach, for example, or if he went to go get another job, that would, in a way, validate what the government did to him and say, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. But what he did is he chose to perform the injury that was afflicted upon him by the government and say, no, I have dreamed and worked my entire life to be an astronomer, and I refuse to be anything but that. And he wanted to serve his country. That's all he really wanted to do at the end of the day. I think he would have been probably one of the first 10 or 20 employees at NASA if he had been allowed to stay, because NASA was really formed from the Army, which is where he was working. And so he saw that tragedy and he understood the optics of it. And he was willing to kind of be that sacrificial lamb, you might say, to show and illustrate to the American people the injustice that was happening. And I think that's really remarkable, that level of personal sacrifice that is very rare to have at least such a visible example of that.
And to be clear, when exactly did the government stop summarily firing people for being gay?
Depends what part of the government. So the most of the civilian agencies within the government, that ended around 1975, in a large part because of some of the civil suits, the legal cases that were initiated by Frank Kameny and some of the plaintiffs that he recruited. The problem is then you also have some of the more security clearance heavy agencies like the FBI, the CIA. Those continued well into the 90s. It wasn't until the Clinton administration when your sexual orientation didn't preclude you from holding these jobs and serving your country. And then, of course, within the military, that continued well into the Obama administration, and then up until just this year with trans Americans not being allowed to serve their own country. And so it just shows that this process of politicians using a persecuted minority in order to gain political points as part of some larger culture war. It keeps happening over and over again, and you're seeing it in so many different states with Republicans waging war against trans children. And it's the exact same phenomenon of, they recognize that this is a political tool to get their base angry. And so they're choosing those who have always been the most marginalized within our country to hurt even further.
One of the things that comes up here and there in the book, this is kind of a random aside, is the Kinsey Report. And I just thought maybe I'd ask about, what, like, I think everyone knows what the Kinsey Report is, but how that really kind of shaped society, and how, when policymakers started looking at actual science and instead of this sort of the moral arguments against the LGBT community.
Well, it's important to remember that when Kinsey conducted a study, which was really the first really scientifically rigorous study of human sexual behavior on a massive scale, and published his findings in 1948, at the time, there were an incredible number of laws that regulate, many of which are still on the books, that regulated sexual activity. So in many, many states, having sex with someone before marriage, that was against the law. Having sex with someone of a different race, that was against the law. Having any sort of procreative sex was against the law. And so what Kinsey found was that people all across the country of all different sexual orientations were breaking the law. Something like 95% of all men had broken some sort of sexual law. And so what that did was it revealed that these laws that supposedly were regulating homosexual activity, sodomy, all these, they just didn't make sense. And on top of that, they were being unequally applied. So of course, people weren't being thrown into jail for having premarital sex. They were being thrown into jail for having sex with someone, with another man, for example. And on top of that, he also revealed that a huge number of men were engaging in same-sex activity. Something like 37% of men had reached orgasm with another man at some time in their lives. So just a huge number compared to what people had originally thought. And it really thrust the entire topic of homosexuality into the press, because it hit something like number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. All these different publications found themselves having to discuss the Kinsey Report, when before that, a lot of folks referred to it as a conspiracy of silence regarding homosexuality. And so I think you could really point to that as one of the beginnings of the sexual revolution, at least within the media, and kind of opened the floodgates for further discussions of being gay, and also how people who were queer at the time were persecuted.
Let's speed up to, I believe it was 1961. Is that right? With the first protests?
That was the first meeting of the Mattachine Society, which then very soon thereafter organized the first protest. Yeah.
Let's talk about the protest. What inspired Kameny to decide, hey, not only am I going to have sort of this legal proceeding with my name on the record, which he did manage to dodge press successfully from that, but then to take this extra step of really sticking his neck out there.
Right. Well, so many of the lawsuits, when he filed his suit, and then the Supreme Court said, no, we won't even listen to it. And he tried to recruit other people to also sue. As anyone knows who's had any dealings with the law, it takes a very long time. It's a very arduous process. And, Frank Kameny and others like Randy Wicker and, Lily Vincennes within the Washington Mattachine were watching just how quickly progress was being made in the realm of the Black freedom movement. Looking at, for example, Selma, and then the immediate results that had leading to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and not to mention Birmingham, and all these different instances of direct action of people taking to the streets and putting their bodies on the line, that resulting in very swift political change in a way that legal proceedings or even legislative action couldn't produce. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you have Selma in the spring of 65, and then literally weeks later, gays are marching for the first time in front of the White House. And it's because they were aware this was all being covered in the news, and they saw the effects that it had on President Johnson, on Congress, on the American public and the media, and they wanted to replicate that. And so I think that's a theme that you see time and time again throughout the book that I hope is abundantly clear, especially now, is that every step of the way, as Frank Kameny and others were building what we now celebrate, now June 1st, as Pride, they were borrowing from the Black freedom movement, and they weren't always being the most, they weren't always recognizing just how much they were depending on and copying and arguably plagiarizing. If you're not making space for people who are at the intersection of those two movements, which I think the homophile movement, at least the pre-Stonewall movement, certainly failed to do that. I think you have to ask, what's our moral obligation now that we're benefiting from so many of the struggles that resulted from replicating the Black freedom movement. Now, what do we have, especially as white gay men, to make that history right and say, okay, we now have had these incredible advances in our civil rights, but now who did we leave behind in the process?
And what can we say came out of those first protests? What kind of attention did they get?
It certainly got attention. I think they got a little disappointed because at the same time, it was kind of bad timing on their part because, of course, you start marching in 1965. What else is happening in the country around that time? Well, Vietnam is starting to become a huge issue. And in fact, the very first march in front of the White House with the exact same day as the first major anti-war march in Washington that was, thousands and thousands of people compared to only 10 of Frank Kameny's crews. So they were starting to get a little bit overshadowed. But what happened is, photographers came. They took photos and they published them in newspapers all across the country. And so suddenly, instead of seeing these shadowy images of an anonymous person, hanging in a public restroom or a public park as the image of what it meant to be homosexual, then, you start to see in newspapers all across the country when they're talking about the queer community, they didn't use that word, but the homophiles or, the sexual deviants, suddenly you saw people in suit and tie picketing signs in front of the White House, which sent a very, very different message. And I would argue helped lead some of the groundwork, which was then available when there was that huge influx after Stonewall of new activists who were joining the movement. They already had these annual marches because they continued each year, just once a year, called the Reminder Day Picket in Philadelphia. That continued every year. And then that march then was turned after Stonewall into the Pride marches or the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, which now continues each and every June.
So now we're kind of getting into sort of the changing politics of the time, and I'm wondering how, as Frank got older, as the Mattachine Society changed, what were some of the ways that his politics shifted, and was he ever in conflict with some of the rest of the community, or was he always on the right side of every issue?
He certainly thought he was on the right side of every issue. But I think that it was kind of a two-sided coin because I think he was so certain. He's a very difficult person. Any person I talked to who knew him would say that, the one word to describe him was difficult because he was very certain, Harvard PhD. He was just always right, loved to argue with people. And so that made it very easy for him to argue against the federal government when they screwed him over. But then when you have this new generation of activists, especially in the latter half of the 60s, starting to enter the movement and saying, you know what, we don't really want to wear a suit and tie in front of the White House while marching for our rights in July, which, as you know, in DC is a horrific proposition to be
Wouldn't
wearing a suit
recommend
and
it.
tie. Yeah, and for an hour without, talking or drinking or anything, because he was very attached to this idea of respectability and saying, we need to look visibly like federal employees. We need to look, in other words, like straight people in order to be accepted by the public and by the government. And then you have this new generation of activists coming from places like Columbia University, or coming from, all over the country, saying, no, thank you. we want to wear, we want to wear drag. We want to wear our heels. We want to wear our beards and beads and long hair. And so you have this very, very visual, explicit conflict between the older generation of activists like Frank and the newer one. And in some ways, he was able to adapt at least some of his rhetoric, like adapting, Black is beautiful became gay is good. But because he wasn't really able to separate himself from the tactics of respectability, at the end of the day, these new generation of activists overwhelmed him and voted to essentially strip him of his power over the movement and over the marches. And that's why, we don't, for good reason, we don't think of Pride as Frank Kameny's holiday, right? Because it's everyone's holiday, as it should be. But I think he could have made that process a little easier on himself, and adapting to a much more diverse, younger, more vibrant movement in a way that he wasn't really able to do.
And so I think what you're getting at, this conflict here is a perfect segue into sort of what happened next, which was he decided to run for Congress. I would love to, obviously, Victory Institute, just going to plug us for a second. We train people to run for LGBTQ people to run for office at every level. And we have programs in the US and around the world. So go to victoryinstitute.org to learn more if you yourself are interested in running for office. But tell me about Frank and his, what motivated him to run.
Well, I think he recognized, first of all, that his time was kind of up when it came to leading the movement itself. And I think he always, from the beginning, he just wanted to serve his country. He wanted he recognized that he was a very smart person with a lot of capabilities that he wanted to give to his country. And he recognized, well, now, one way to make progress, to do something that has never been done before. Now that we're all marching, thousands of us are marching on the streets every June. He said, well, what hasn't been done yet is there has never been an openly gay member of Congress. And so in 1971, it was the very first election for at the time and still a non-voting delegate to Congress. He was one of the candidates, and he was in one of the top 5 or so, and he only got 3% or some very small number of the percentage of the vote. But what was so incredible was, again, he recognized the importance of the media and of the public perception, and it made national waves all throughout, not just the gay press, but also through the national press, because there had never been an openly gay man running, not just on a platform of gay rights, but on intersectional justice and running for racial justice, and explaining how, he as a queer man also meant he understood the plight of being Black in Washington, D.C., or, was at least able to empathize with that. And I think that shows us what is possible now, especially within electoral politics, of that, if we're queer, then I think we have a moral obligation to be fighting for justice on all levels. And we're not free until everyone's free. And I think Frank recognized that. He made some mistakes, I think, in that campaign, but I think it shows that there's just so much more to be done in the realm of politics, and that's why I'm so glad that the Victory Institute's around to help encourage us.
Yes, and just revisiting all of this history, even with Frank, of course, Victory Fund was started in 1991. So I don't always draw the direct dots, but I imagine that Frank and the coverage he got would have inspired a lot of the people we're more familiar with who actually did win public offices as LGBTQ candidates.
Absolutely.
Dr. Eric Cervini, I'm going to hold up your book so that everyone knows what they're looking for. Where can we get the deviants for your biography of Frank Kameny?
Ooh, so many different places. If you're in DC, Politics and Prose, or there's so many independent shops that could really use our business now that things are opening back up. So I always suggest that. But otherwise, my website's just ericcervini.com. It has a list of everywhere you can get it. But anywhere you can buy books, you should be able to get it.
Thank you so much for coming on and for discussing Kameny with us today. This has been so wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, you have a good